So I've called tonight's talk Learning to Let Go. And one of the ways that we could look at the Buddhist path is it is a path of learning to let go. That's one of the ways that we could conceive of it. So all Buddhist practice is essentially aimed at helping us to let go of our egotistical way of seeing and acting in the world. That's kind of the fundamental thing that we're trying to do. So Buddhism says that's the thing that makes us suffer, and that is something that we can be free of. So all of Buddhist practice is kind of directly or indirectly trying to help us get to that goal. So our practice of ethics, meditation, reflecting on teachings, they're all part of a gradual path to let go of ego clinging, or kind of clinging to a sense of self. And in this way, it's a kind of gradual path. The letting go is subtle. It might be quite a gradual change. It might be a change that's so kind of imperceptible day to day that you only really notice from looking back after a couple of years. Oh, I can see I've changed there. I can see that I've let go of things that I was holding on to before. But there are also there's also a possibility of big breakthroughs in spiritual life, kind of big shattering moments where we see something much more clearly. We let go of something quite fully and kind of shatter our habitual way of being in the world. And these can be experienced through various ways. Sometimes it might be life events. Even if people aren't practicing a spiritual practice, big life events can often have this effect. The things that we feel are secure and we rely on, suddenly if they're taken away, it can have this shattering effect. It could be in meditation, in deep meditation experiences, we can see much more clearly and let go of things that we're holding on to. Or they may come about through communication. So through communicating with someone else, it can have this effect. And it seems that people had this experience a lot when they were communicating with the Buddha. There was something about the Buddha's communication, kind of what he said, his way of being, that seemed to be able to have this effect on people where they could suddenly see much more clearly and let go of things that were causing them suffering and holding them back, essentially. And the Buddha's communication was often referred to as a lion's roar. So he had this power of a lion's roar. And so it's kind of a sound that affects us to the core. Kind of, if we were sat here and we heard a lion, like a lot of our being would respond to that on a lot of levels. So it's kind of a lion's roar. And this also reminds us that the Buddha's communication was not limited to just words as well. So a lion's roar is a kind of non-conceptual communication. If you hear a lion, if an animal hears a lion do its roar, it kind of gets the picture. It doesn't need to figure it out. It kind of communicates something just by itself, doesn't it? So that's kind of, the Buddha's teaching can be called a lion's roar. And throughout the tradition, we have stories of teachers communicating to their disciples in this way, giving them direct teachings, direct experiential teachings that words never could. So there's a lot of teaching done in the Buddhist tradition, giving teachings, talking, kind of using the intellect. But there's also these moments of a direct teaching beyond words. And especially in Zen Buddhism and Tantric Buddhism, so kind of like Tibetan Buddhism, you get some very unconventional Buddhist gurus. Kind of the more Buddhism develops, the more kind of wild and unexpected they become. And so in these later traditions, you have some very unusual teachings and shocking teachings that kind of wake their disciples up in a way that's not just teaching them and showing them through some scriptures. It's kind of a direct experiential teaching. And the story we're going to be reflecting on tonight is one of those teachings. So I'm going to tell us a story, and then in the second half we're going to unpack it and kind of explore why it's relevant to us. And I mentioned at the beginning about stories. And I was saying about how we're always telling ourselves stories and that we can let go of them because they'll quite often be limiting our view of the world. They'll be limiting our view of other people and ourselves. But there are also stories that are really important. There are helpful stories as well. So when we hear stories from the Buddhist tradition, it's not like, no, just let go of them. These are stories that we can hold on to, we can hold in our hearts and reflect over and find deeper and deeper meaning in. So I think stories are really, really important, and we're going to be looking at a story today. So I just wanted to say that just in case my earlier teaching kind of poo-pooed stories, but I'm very pro-story in a certain way. So we're going to go back around 1,000 years. So this story took place about 1,000 years ago to a jungle in India. So we've travelled across the world to a jungle in India. So we're miles away from any nearest town, any nearest village, and we're in the densest jungle. So we're in the hot, dense jungle. And we meet a man. So a man's travelling through this jungle. Now he's quite a big, stocky, well-built man. He was a farmer by trade, but he's really struggling. He's really struggling in the jungle. So he's in India, but he's not Indian. He's a Tibetan. So in Tibet, they live quite high up in very cold climates. He's a farmer in Tibet, so he is used to a much colder place. But he's travelled down to India, and it's so hot compared to what he's used to. So he's finding it really unpleasant, basically. So he's walking through this jungle in the hot climate when he's used to the cold mountains of Tibet. So he's been in India for 2 years now. And he's already been to India 2 times before as well, but this time he really hasn't had an easy time. So he's travelled to India, and some stuff's happened before this. So in this time, he's been arrested by a king, and he was imprisoned because the king took a disliking to him. So he was imprisoned, but he managed to find his way out, and so he's carried on his journey. And although he's a strong guy, he's kind of like a big, stocky, strong guy, but he's finding the journey hard because he's carrying this heavy bag. So he's got this leather bag with him round his shoulder. He's kind of stooped over, and you can kind of imagine him plodding on. He's been carrying this bag for 2 years as well. So it's 2 years of travelling on foot, carrying this big heavy bag around with him. And he's carried it every step of the way from his journey, from the top of the tall mountains in the Himalayas all the way down through India. He's been carrying this bag on the whole journey with him. And he's so used to carrying it that it's basically like a part of him now. You know, when you've had something for so long, kind of imagine if you have glasses or something, it kind of becomes a bit of a part of you. It's kind of like that with this bag. This bag kind of become part of him now. So the man we've encountered is a Tibetan called Marpa. Yeah, so there's a Tibetan called Marpa, and he's quite a famous figure in certain traditions of Tibetan Buddhism. And so he himself is a Tibetan tantric teacher. So that it means a teacher of the tantra. I'm not going to explain the tantra actually, but it's a more developed version of Buddhism, basically, kind of a lot of symbol and ritual and more esoteric teachings. But that's not that important for the story. So yeah, but he's a tantric teacher himself, and he's traveling because he has a disciple, and the disciple asked him for a teaching that he didn't have. Yeah, so his disciple asked him for a teaching which he didn't have, and rather than just saying, nope, sorry, don't have that one, he said, no, I'm going to go find that teaching. So he went on this big journey to look for his own teacher. He looked for his own guru. So he was taught by... he was taught by a teacher called Naropa. Yeah, so these are the 2 characters in the story. We've got Marpa, and then we've got his teacher Naropa. Yeah, so they're the names to remember. So the teacher, Naropa, is an Indian Buddhist master. And originally, Naropa was a scholar, basically. He lived in a monastery, and he was a really well-respected scholar. So he kind of studied Buddhism really deeply, had a very deep knowledge of the Dharma, very deep knowledge of the Buddha's teachings. And in Tibetan times, they kind of engaged in these debates where they'd kind of try and outsmart each other with kind of logic and knowledge of the Dharma, which is quite different. I can't imagine us doing it here now, but you basically it would be like having 2 experienced order members sit up the front in front of everyone and then just try and outsmart each other with like little logic tricks. Now I trust that there was a spiritual reason behind that, but it just seemed quite alien to how we practice now. But that was what Naropa was really famous for. He was a really learned scholar. He was very respected, and he was working his way up the monastery. So he was becoming a very important person in the monastery. But one day, there's a bit of a story to it, but I'll just say for one day, he basically realised that all of his knowledge that he had was all just facts. It was all just knowledge on the surface level, kind of like mind knowledge. He didn't actually know the teachings from his own experience. He didn't have a deep understanding of the teachings from his experience. And he then saw through the whole, his status, his prestige, kind of his winning of the debates. He kind of saw through all of that and realised, actually, I need to know it for myself. I need to have a deep experience of the Dharma. I don't just want to know about it. So he left, quite shockingly, he left the monastery, and he went off and in search of a teacher that would teach him the direct knowledge. And so that was where he left it. So that's a little bit about Naropa. So we've got Marpa, who's a Tibetan farmer but is a tantric guru. And we've got Naropa, who's kind of an ex-scholarly monk who's now another very revered tantric master. So Marpa's been travelling all the way to India to come and find Naropa, but he's found out that Naropa has gone missing. So he went to where he thought Naropa was, but his disciples said, oh no, Naropa's gone. He was quite an unconventional character, so I think he just up and left. And they said, we don't know where he is, but we know he's west. So every time he went west, and every time he found someone, they said, oh yeah, he's further west. And he'd keep going, oh yeah, it's further west. So I guess he's gone quite far west by now. So he's vanished, and Naropa's vanished. He's gone into solitary retreat. But Marpa, rather than being disheartened, rather than saying, "Oh, I think I'm not going to get that teaching," he decides to continue looking. So he continues searching for Naropa, and eventually he turns a corner into a clearing, and there in front of him is Naropa, seated deep in meditation. And Naropa's no longer someone you could recognise as a scholarly monk. He's probably gone, you could imagine he's gone feral, basically, on the surface anyway. His years of trials and spiritual realizations have turned him into a very unconventional character, kind of like a wild character. And yeah, he's now renowned for being completely free, completely spontaneous and unconventional. Yeah, so you can imagine the Naropa of before, when he was a scholarly monk, would have been very proper, followed all the rules, very conventional in a certain way, whereas now he's quite wild, quite unpredictable, quite spontaneous. And you can imagine being around someone like this, it must be very, very exciting, but also quite terrifying, because you don't know what they're going to do at any moment either. So Marpa is overjoyed. He's been searching for 2 years for his teacher, his beloved teacher. He's been searching for him, and eventually he finds him, he comes across him. So he runs up, he gives him a massive hug, and because he's so exhausted, he then just passes out on the floor. So we've got Naropa there looking after a passed out Marpa, who is very happy but very tired. And then once he's able to move again, he then picks up his bag and he presents it to Naropa. So this whole time he's been carrying this bag, it's because he's been carrying something that he wants to give to his teacher, that he wants to give to Naropa. So he picks up this bag, he gives it to Naropa. Naropa then takes the bag, he looks inside, and it's full of gold dust. So that's what Marpa's been carrying this whole time. He's been carrying, for 2 years, he's been carrying this big heavy bag of gold dust on his sack everywhere he's gone, taking extreme care of it, so that when he finds Naropa, he can give him this bag of gold dust. Yeah, so he's given them this whole bag of gold dust. Now there's a fortune in this bag. Yeah, it said there's an absolute fortune. So Marpa could have done anything with that money. He could have extended his farm. He could have paid for more teachings just to be brought to him. He could have supported loads of people to live with him and work with him and teach them. There's all sorts of things he could have done with that. But what he decided to do was to bring it to his teacher, to bring it to Naropa and present it to him. So Naropa then takes it, and now I imagine Marpa would probably be thinking, Naropa could do so much good with this gold. He could build a monastery, he could support his disciples, he could use this to spread the Buddha's teachings. And Naropa is truly moved by this generosity. He looks at the wealth in this bag. He knows what Marpa did to get it there. He knows what Marpa could have done with it. And so he's overcome with gratitude for this generosity. He sees the faith, love and devotion of his disciple that's brought him there, that's given him this gift. And the gift inspires great generosity in Naropa as well. So Naropa wants to respond to that generosity with generosity. So he decides he wants to give Marpa a really great teaching. He wants to give him kind of the greatest teaching he can give him. And Naropa knows just what to do. He knows exactly what Marpa needs. He knows the exact teaching that Marpa needs. Now, this isn't that he kind of came up with this. Naropa at this point is completely free and spontaneous. So he kind of instantly responded knowing what was right for Marpa. So what he does is he holds the bag of gold in the air. He looks at it for a moment. He chucks it up. It turns inside out. And the gold dust disappears in a puff of golden cloud. So yeah, within an instant, there's this great golden cloud filling the air. And Marpa can't believe his eyes. He's been carrying this bag for 2 years. He's presented it to his teacher, and his teacher's chucked it in the air, and the gold has just gone everywhere. But then in that instant, it's as if, like the bag, Marpa has been turned inside out. It's kind of he can see himself in that bag. He's been turned inside out. And it's as if for a moment his mind completely stops. And then in that instant, he has a tremendous breakthrough, and he sees something that he's never seen before. Yeah, so that's where we're going to leave that story for now. I say leave that story for now. That's the end of the story for today. But what we're going to do is we're going to come back in the second half, and we're going to explore the story, kind of explore what it means for us now, for our lives. Because there's loads we can take from it that is relevant to our lives, even if on the surface of it, not so clear. So come back in the second half and we'll kind of unpack it more. But we'll go through and have a tea break now. So we're going to go back to the story now, and we're basically going to unpack it. And just it's important to remember that these stories have kind of deep metaphorical, symbolical meanings. So that's what we'll be unpacking now, is kind of like the symbolic, metaphorical meaning of the stories. So we'll kind of go through it chronologically. So we started off with Marpa, our friend Martha, the tantric teacher from Tibet, and he was wandering through the jungle, and there was this intense heat. So he was suffering from this intense heat. And we could see this heat as a metaphor for the suffering of the enlightened mind. So the heat is a metaphor for the suffering of the enlightened mind. Now, fire and heat are often used as an image for suffering in the Buddhist tradition. So the Buddha said that the world is on fire with greed, hatred, and delusion. The world is on fire with greed, hatred, and delusion. And with that comes the kind of metaphor of feeling the heat and kind of feeling burned under the heat. So if the world is on fire, we're kind of there suffering from that heat. And perhaps on some days we can kind of recognize ourselves in that state. If we're really suffering, you can kind of imagine ourselves as Marpa, kind of going through life, kind of finding it all quite difficult, all quite hard, like we've got a big Indian sun beating down on us when we're not used to it. So that's kind of a metaphor for that would be, well, that's one way of seeing the metaphor of the heat, is kind of the suffering for the enlightened mind. Now, Marpa has been travelling for 2 years, so it's been a very strenuous journey. He's been carrying this heavy bag, but he's been willing to work hard. So he's been willing to work hard for the journey, work hard for what he's trying to gain. And he's trying to get these teachings from his teacher. Now he's doing it for his disciple, but he'll also be doing it for his own spiritual development as well. He wants these teachings, and he's willing to put in the effort to get there. Now this kind of highlights the point that we do need to work hard in the spiritual life. We need to be willing to work hard if we want to work on our minds, if we want to develop our minds. And if you look from the outside, practicing meditation in Buddhism can often look very chilled out in a certain way. Kind of, if you looked at the meditation room from the outside while we were all meditating, it's like, oh yeah, that looks pretty chilled. But actually it requires a lot of determination and a lot of effort to consistently and systematically develop our mind. We do need to put in a lot of effort. But people can often think that it's all about relaxing. And when I was ordained, I was working as a primary school teacher at the time, and I needed to take a term off. So there's an 11-week retreat you go on. I needed to take a term off from my job. And I had to tell the parents what was going on. So I was like, I'm going to do an 11-week retreat to get ordained as a Buddhist monk. And no, I didn't say monk. Why did I say that? I think I'm just two in the story. I wasn't Buddhist. I'm going to get ordained as a Buddhist. So I'm going on an 11-week retreat to get ordained as a Buddhist. And one of the children's mums replied, "Oh yeah, teachers deserve a break." And I was a bit like, yeah, not quite the idea, but that is the perception, isn't it? It's like you go on retreat. It's like I hear other people say, like, they go on retreat and they come back. They've had a really difficult retreat. They've really grappled with their minds. They've kind of had a big opening up. They get back to work and they're like, "Oh, do you have a relaxing time?" And it's just kind of that's the perception. But actually, we do need to work really hard. We need to be willing to work hard and to strive in a certain way if we want to develop our minds. But we can quite often have an aversion to that or not want to do that when we first start practicing. When I first came along to the Buddhist Centre, I was working really hard in my job, and I feel like I felt like meditation was because I wanted to stop working hard, basically. So when we were taught the Metta Bhavana, and one of the phrases was, "May I make progress," I really reacted to it. I was like, I don't want to make progress. I'm making progress in all the other parts of my life. I don't want to have to make progress here as well. And I could just see it's like I didn't want to put the effort in, basically. I wanted it just to be this nice chilled out thing where I could just enjoy. But we do need to put effort in. And it's important, so that in Buddhism, effort is so important that perfect effort is one of the steps of the Noble Eightfold Path. Yes, there's the Noble Eightfold Path, which is one of the primary teachings of the Buddha, and one of the stages is perfect effort. Now, another list is called the Four Right Efforts as well. So I'll quickly go through them just to kind of flesh out what effort looks like in the Buddhist context, because it's not the same as just worldly effort, trying to strive to gain things. So the first one is preventing unskillful mental states from arising. Yeah, so preventing unskillful mental states from arising. Now this involves being aware of the conditions that lead to negative mental states. So negative mental states are conditioned by the things that we do with our mind. Yeah, so if we do certain things, they'll give rise to negative mental states. So one of the things is we need to avoid the things that give rise to negative mental states. That's how we prevent them. The next step is transforming unskillful mental states. So we need to transform unskillful mental states that have arisen. And we do that by working on what's called the hindrances in meditation. So there's these hindrances that are common to all minds, basically. We'll all have some form of these hindrances going on when we're meditating, if we're not completely absorbed. So these are craving, aversion or hatred, restlessness and anxiety, sleepiness and sluggishness, and then doubt and indecision. Yeah, so I'll just read these one more time. There's craving, aversion or hatred, restlessness and anxiety, sleepiness and sluggishness, and doubt and indecision. Yeah, so they're the things that will stop us from being able to fully engage in meditation. And if we want to practice Buddhism, if we want to develop our minds, we need to work with transforming those mental states in meditation. So we've got preventing unskillful mental states from arising. We've got transforming unskillful mental states that have arisen. And then we need to develop skillful mental states as well. So we do this by cultivating deeper states in meditation, such as concentration, absorption, and loving kindness. So when practicing the mindfulness of breathing, when practicing the Metta Bhavana, we'll be cultivating these skillful mental states. We'll be developing these positive mental states. So hopefully already you can see that you should be doing, or hopefully you're doing some of these already. It's just kind of, we can bring more awareness to these different stages. And finally, we need to maintain the skillful mental states that have arisen. Yeah, so the ones that we've arisen, we need to keep on putting the effort in to keep them in our mind. Yeah. So they're the four right efforts. So that's kind of like the Buddhist perspective on effort. So it's not the same as kind of working really hard in like a worldly sense in our jobs or something like that. It's more about effort in working with our mind to be aware of what mental states we're in and then working with them creatively. Okay, so another aspect is that he left his country. So he lived in Tibet and he left Tibet to go to India. And here he left his comfort zone, basically. So he left his comfort zone in search of teachings, in search of ways to practice the Dharma. So he had this big farm, he had a wife, and he had a house where he would have been very comfortable, but he's been willing to leave the comfort of his house for the sake of his spiritual life, for the sake of developing his mind. Yeah. So if we want to keep growing, we're going to need to be willing to go beyond our comfort zone. There's kind of no way to keep growing if we're not willing to go beyond our comfort zone. But we have a tendency to want life to be as comfortable as possible, and all of us have that. We all have a tendency to want to make life comfortable, and in itself that's not a bad thing. Having a comfortable life isn't necessarily a bad thing, but the problem is that it can make us avoid things that challenge us or make us uncomfortable. Yeah, so if something's challenging, it might be uncomfortable. Yeah, but if it's challenging, that's when we grow. So it's often areas of challenge where there's the most growth. Yeah, so we need to be willing to go beyond our comfort zone if we want to keep on growing. So now some of the ways that we can do this, one of them is taking up responsibility. Yeah, so we could take up a responsibility where often when we have a responsibility, we need to do things that we don't necessarily want to do. There'll be things that, I might not be in the mood to do this, but because I have a responsibility, I'm going to do this, whether we feel like it or not. And the reason why this is dharmically significant, and why this is significant for working on our minds, is because it means that we then go beyond the preferences that kind of limit us and keep us small. So our preferences we kind of cling to and try and protect, but in doing that, that keeps us small. It stops us from expanding, it stops us from going out to other people. Yeah, so if we take up a responsibility, often we then have to do things we might not choose to do for something that hopefully we believe in. The next one could be going on retreat. So going on retreat for the first time is a way to go beyond our comfort zone. If we've never been on retreats, when we go on retreat, we'll be stepping into something we don't know for the sake of developing our minds. So that's a really positive step of going beyond our comfort zone. And if you've been on, say you've been on a weekend retreat, you might want to go on a week-long retreat. If you've been on a week-long retreat, you might want to go on a 2-week-long retreat. If you've been on a 2-week retreat, you might want to go on a solitary retreat. Yeah, so in a way, we can keep on going on retreat, going beyond our comfort level, to keep growing, to keep exploring deeper parts of our mind that we'll get in by going on longer retreats. Now, David Mitra, who lives and teaches here, he did a 9-month solitary retreat at one point. A 9-month solitary retreat. But he didn't do that straight away. But he did do a 5-week retreat straight away. It's quite funny. He tells the story. He's like, my friend did 4, so I did 5. But anyway, he didn't start with a 9-month solitary, but it's kind of like he knew that he had to keep stretching himself, keep on going beyond his comfort zone, to keep growing in that way. Yeah, and one last way we might go beyond our comfort zone is to get into deeper communication with other people. Yeah, so in Buddhism, communication is really important. There's 4. There's a list called the 10 Precepts, which is kind of guidance for how you can act in a way that leads to more positive mental states, and 4 of those are to do with speech. Yeah, so communication is really important in the Buddhist tradition. And yeah, a way to go beyond our comfort zone is to get into deeper communication than we normally would. So being honest, being and exposing ourselves to others can feel scary and uncomfortable at first. So if we're more honest than we're used to being, or if we let ourselves be seen more fully than we're used to be seeing, it's likely that will be slightly scary and uncomfortable. But to the extent that we hold things back from others is the extent that we feel disconnected from others. Yeah, so to the extent we're holding things back, to that extent we'll feel disconnected. But to the extent that we are honest and open with others, to that extent we feel connected. Yeah, and one of the things we're trying to move towards in Buddhist practice is feeling more connected with other people, more connected with life at large. Yeah, so it's really important that we can communicate fully with other people, but that might involve going beyond what we feel is comfortable. Yeah, we might have fear arise when we feel like we're going to share something, but often, especially if it's done within a Buddhist context, it'll be met with awareness and kindness. Yeah, that's kind of that's the attitude that we bring to communication. Is even if someone's sharing something that they're not proud of, the ideal is that it's met with awareness and kindness. Yeah, so we can get into more deep communication with other people. And I lived in a community upstairs for a year and a half, a few years ago. And when I first moved in there, I found it really hard to be fully honest with others. Because I wasn't used to being that honest, basically. I wasn't used to communicating in a way that was really exposing. And yeah, I found it hard to be honest about what I was thinking, what I was feeling, and what I was doing. I found it really hard to just let people see me fully. And in a way, that made me feel on the outside. Yeah, because I wasn't fully opening up, I just had this sense of, oh, I'm on the outside. But once I learned to communicate more honestly, I felt much more connected to all the people I was with. But it was only through going through that process of being willing to kind of expose myself more than I felt comfortable doing. And then actually when that was received well, it's like, oh, I can do that. And then you keep doing it more and more. And then to the point where you just feel really fully connected with people because you're not trying to hide, you're not trying to hold anything back. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next section of the story now. Well, we're going to reflect on Marpa's bag of gold now. Yes, that's what we're going to reflect on. So the image of gold, it's an interesting thing. So he's been carrying this bag that's been weighing him down, and it's filled with gold. And it's significant that it's filled with gold, isn't it? And not some other material. So the story would feel very different if he'd been carrying a sack of coal. Like, it would have a very different feel to it, wouldn't it? So gold is definitely symbolic on many levels. So gold, like in all traditions, you can see gold being a symbol. So we're going to spend a bit of time exploring different aspects of it. So one of the main connotations with gold is that it's something of great value, isn't it? It's one of the rare, it's one of the precious metals, precious materials in the world. It's rare, it's beautiful, it's durable, and it's malleable. Yeah, so it's rare, beautiful, durable, and malleable. Now, Marpa's an experienced Buddhist practitioner by this point. He's not someone who's just started on the path. He's someone that has a very high level of attainment. And so we're not encountering someone at the beginning of their journey. He's spent years and years refining his mind already when he's taken this journey. And you could say that Marpa's mind has become rare, beautiful, durable, and malleable. Yeah, so he's cultivated states that are rare, beautiful, durable, and malleable. Yet he's not completely liberated. So at this point, he's not a completely liberated being. He still has attachments. He's still got clinging that stop him from gaining awakening. So he's been carrying this bag for 2 years, and it's been weighing him down. He's walking with this bag. It's been weighing him down. And he experiences the bag as precious, important, valuable, but also heavy. So he experiences it as valuable, but also heavy. And this could speak to the fact that our attachments, they weigh us down. Whatever we're attached to some extent, it weighs us down. And our egotistical way of being in the world weighs us down. Yeah, so we have a tendency to put ourselves in the center of things. We always when we have an experience, we refer it to ourselves. We're often trying to get our needs met, sometimes at the expense of other people's. This is just the natural way that human beings function. It's not that we're uniquely flawed. That's just the natural way we function. And this weighs us down. Yeah, and this sense of self that we carry around, this kind of clinging, narrow sense of ourself, it weighs us down. It's as if we're carrying a great weight with us, often without realizing it. Often we don't even realize we're carrying this great weight. And we use a great amount of energy to protect, preserve, and enhance ourselves. Yeah, so we're always trying to protect ourselves, we're trying to enhance ourselves, and we're trying to preserve ourselves. And this uses up a great amount of energy without even realizing it. And it makes us weary and tired in a way that often we don't realize until we've been on retreat quite a lot of the time. Quite often you get on retreat, after a few days you start to realize how weighed down, how weary, how tired you were. But when we're in the business of day-to-day life, when we're busy trying to get our needs met and trying to get what we want and push away what we don't want, we don't really feel how heavy it is, but it's really weighing us down all the time. So that's one way we could look at this image, is that he's carrying this thing, he feels like it's valuable, he wants to protect it, but it's weighing him down, it's causing him suffering. But there's also positive elements to this image as well. Yeah, so this is an element of it's causing him suffering, but there's also positive elements to the image. It shows how highly he values the Dharma and his teacher as well. So he's carried this bag of gold. So he's first accumulated the gold, and he's then willing to carry it for 2 years for a teaching and for his teacher. Yeah, so it shows how much he values the Dharma. It shows how much he values his teacher. And often these days, myself included, we just don't feel that now. Yeah, everything's so on tap, isn't it? We have so much accessibility to everything. We really don't value things in the same way. And I could imagine, again, myself included, we'd find it hard to wait 2 days for things, let alone 2 years. It's kind of like we have Amazon Prime now. And it's like, why do I need to wait 2 days for something? Whereas he's travelled 2 years for this teaching. He's travelled 2 years to find his teacher and just kept on going. As far as I'm aware, there wasn't any doubt. There wasn't any turning back. Like I said, he got arrested, put into jail. When he got free from that, he wasn't like, oh no, I'm going to go home now. He carried on going. Yeah. So there's so much, and even just in Dharma terms in Buddha's teachings, there's so much there's so many printed books. There's so many online talks and videos. No teachings feel precious anymore, or valuable in that way, because there's so much accessibility to it. They just don't feel valuable in that way anymore. But at the time of the Buddha, there weren't any books. There wasn't any books with the Buddha's teachings at the time. Things got written down 500 years after, and then it was a long time before there's any kind of printed press. So at the time of the Buddha, there weren't any books, and most people, if they were lucky, they'd see the Buddha maybe once or twice in their life. Yeah, so that's how often they'd come across the Buddha's teachings, is they might encounter the Buddha maybe once, maybe twice. A few people were lucky and got to live with him, but most people, that was as much as they'd encounter him. And they'd receive a particular teaching from the Buddha, and they'd treasure it and they'd hold on to it and they'd reflect over it. And eventually, with that treasuring, with that reflecting, they'd end up becoming that teaching. That teaching would become part of them. And it's so hard for us to even think of doing that these days. Imagine if you these days, if you just heard like a couple of lines and then didn't read anything else and just kept on reflecting on them. That's just unthinkable now, isn't it? But at the time of the Buddha, that's how people practiced, and people did develop. They gained enlightenment through that. All they needed was a couple of lines to really go deeply into, and they could gain that state, they could gain that liberation. But it's so hard for us to understand that because things are so hyper available to us now. And there's positives to that as well. I'm not saying that's all negatives, but it definitely has a negative side to it. Because we basically exist in this spiritual supermarket. That's the way you could think about it, is we live in this spiritual supermarket. Now, I've read so many books where I'm like excited to start it. I get about halfway through it, and then I just start thinking about the next book I'm going to read. It's kind of like, that's kind of my habitual way of engaging in books, really. It's kind of like, oh, I've got this book, I can't wait to read it. But it's not long before I'm thinking about the next one I'm going to get, let alone reflecting on the one that I've got. Like, we could read a book, read it again, reflect on it, talk about it, reflect on it, read it, go deeply into it. And the thing with the Dharma is every bit of the Dharma is included in every other bit of the Dharma. If we go into any aspect of the Dharma deeply enough, we'll find the rest of it. Yeah, so actually we only need a small number of teachings, but because things are so accessible to us, we can just keep on consuming. And I'm not going to stop doing that. Realistically, I don't think I'm going to stop doing that. It's not realistic for us to stop in a way, but we do need to be aware of the dangers of that and try and at least go against it to some amount. We need to be aware of when we're leaning too much into that and try and actually just stay with things a bit more and go more deeply into things. And it's the same with meditation teachings as well. There's so many different meditation teachings we could do now. I was thinking you could probably do a different guided meditation every day for the rest of your life. I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that. I think you could literally do, if you went online, you could do a different guided meditation every day for the rest of your life. And obviously that sounds quite appealing because you're like, oh, I'll get so much out of all of these different there's so much on offer. Like, I don't want to restrict myself. I want to experience all these different meditations. And Maitre Bandhu, one of my teachers, talks about order members kind of really getting into a book from a specific Buddhist teacher, kind of being like, oh, I'm really into this now, and then a couple months later he'll see them again, and then he'll be like, oh, I'm really into this new book now. And there's no way they would have had time to have really got into the practices. To actually understand meditation practices, it takes a lot of practice. It takes doing it again and again in lots of different states, in different ways, over a length of time, to really see the different aspects of the practice and understand really where it's trying to get to, so we can understand kind of the spirit of the practice beyond the form. We can very quickly engage with the form, but we don't actually get the essence of the practice or what it's trying to get at until we really commit to it and do it lots. So the alternative would be to take one or two practices and really treasure them, really value them, really explore them and deepen in them and become them. That is a possibility, is we can become these practices. Now, at the Buddhist Center, we do teach two practices, conveniently for my last point. But we teach two main practices. We teach the mindfulness of breathing and we teach the metta bhavana. Now, you can learn these practices very quickly. You can learn the stages very quickly. And it would be easy to then feel like, oh yeah, done that one. Let's find another one. Let's find a deeper teaching or a more exciting teaching. But in our tradition, there's a strong emphasis on doing more and more of less and less. So that's a phrase we can think of, doing more and more of less and less. And that means that we can really understand what we're doing on a deeper level, really go into the practices. And we could ask ourselves, do we really feel like we treasure these practices? Now, if I'm honest, not as much as I could. If I'd come across this teaching and it was the only meditation I knew, and it had been given to me and it was the only meditation I knew, and I just have to use that for the rest of my life, I would really treasure that practice. I'd be like, I'm so grateful I've had this practice. But because I know there's so many, I don't treasure them in that way. Whereas actually, if we can have a relationship with the meditation practices we do, that we really treasure them, it will really change our relationship with them and we can go more deeply into them. Yes, that's another aspect of it, is just the valuing of the teachings and the practices. And lastly, it's a symbol of Marpa's generosity as well. So he's willing to give all that wealth to his teacher Naropa. He could have done anything with that wealth, but he's chosen to carry it and given it to his teacher. So generosity is seen as a foundational dharmic quality. It's seen as kind of like the primary dharmic quality that everything else then comes from. And it's said that even if you couldn't be ethical, even if you couldn't practice meditation, even if you couldn't reflect on the teachings, you could at least give. That's kind of like the base minimum thing that we can do. And the reason that's important is because, again, it goes beyond our self-concern. Our habit is to keep hold of things, to tightly grip onto things and try and protect them, whereas generosity goes against that. So it goes against that tendency. So I just want us to reflect now. You could turn into threes again and just feel like, how could you be more generous in your life? What could you do to be more generous? There's a traditional list which we'll go through, but if you explore together, how do you feel like you could be more generous in your life? So there's a traditional list that I'll go through. It's not super long, don't worry. So we can give material possessions to start off with. That's the first level. So material possessions, food, clothing and money. So possessions, food, clothing and money. That's one of the main ways to give. It's one of the easiest ways to give. It's just, we can do that. We can give our time and energy. I think that's kind of what you were saying there as well, like with awareness. But we can give our time and energy to people and things. So we can give ourselves in that way. We can give education and culture, which it sounds quite schooly or something, but actually just by sharing something you're inspired in with people, that can be sharing education and culture. By talking to someone about an experience you've had that they might not have had, that can be giving education and culture as well. So, but then there is also just like traditional teaching as well. We can give fearlessness, which I really like as a gift of generosity. I don't know if you'd come across that in many other places except in Buddhism. So it's like your being can give other people fearlessness. So one of the greatest gifts we can give people is a feeling of like, oh, I can do this, I can keep going, I don't need to be scared. Yeah, so you can do that with just your being there and kind of supporting people. And then finally, we can give the gift of the Dharma. Yeah, so this is seen as the highest form of generosity. We can give the gift of the Dharma. And it's important to remember that in this context, that isn't saying it's not just about teaching. Yeah, you can give the gift of the Dharma in all sorts of different ways. Just by engaging with someone on the basis of loving kindness. If you've been cultivating loving kindness and then you engage them in that way, that's giving the gift of the Dharma. If you can exemplify someone that's trying to work on their mind, you don't have to be perfect. We don't have to have a perfect ethical and mental life, but just by exemplifying it, we can be giving the gift of the Dharma. And also by talking to people about the Dharma and by teaching the Dharma, that's another way we can give the gift of the Dharma. And from a Buddhist perspective, that's the highest gift, because it's through the Dharma that we can actually liberate ourselves. Yeah, that's why it's the highest gift, is because at the end of the day, food, clothing, that's good. Kind of giving people time and energy, that's good. But it's actually only the Dharma that will free us and others from our suffering. Yeah, so that's the highest gift from a Dharmic perspective. Okay, so we'll move on to the final kind of image from the story, which is Naropa pouring the gold away. So when Naropa receives the bag, he just pours it all out. And at first this can seem a bit mean. it's like Marpa's been travelling with that for 2 years and he just poured it away. So at first it can seem a bit mean and a bit ungrateful. It's kind of like, come on. But actually, if we look a little closer, we can see that actually that isn't the case at all. Yeah, so it's not mean and it's not ungrateful. Because when he received the gold, rather than use the gold for his own ends, he used it to give Marpa a teaching. So he could have done all sorts of stuff with that. He could have done all sorts of things with that gold. He could have bought himself some nice new clothes. Like I said, he could have built a monastery. He could have done all sorts of things. But he used it to give Marpa a teaching. So he received the gift of a material possession from Marpa, but he gave the gift of the Dharma in return, which from a Dharmic perspective is a much greater gift. So he was actually being generous by doing that. And it's a strong teaching, isn't it? I don't know if I'd want that teaching right now. It's a strong teaching. But Marpa was no stranger to strong teachings. Like I said, he himself was a tantric teacher. There's a story, he had a disciple called Milarepa, who's quite a famous yogi. And he gave him very strong teachings. He kind of made him, there's this story that he would make him build a tower and then make him take it down again. And then make him build another tower and then make it take it down again, etc., a lot of times. So he was in the business of strong teachings. So we don't need to feel too sorry for Marpa. But yeah, it's a strong lesson, and it's a lesson in attachments, isn't it? It's a lesson in the need to let go of our attachments. If we really want to be free, we need to let go of our attachments. So Marpa had been carrying the bag for 2 years, and he placed a great value on the bag. He placed a great value on the gold. But from an enlightened perspective, gold is no more valuable than any other thing. Like no more valuable than sand, no more valuable than dirt. So from an enlightened perspective, gold isn't any different from anything else. So an enlightened being would just see the equality of all things, the sameness of all things. They'd be able to see uniqueness as well, but they just see all things as the same, as equal in a way. So they wouldn't see it any different from any other material. But to get that perspective, we need to let go of clinging to anything. Yeah, to get to that perspective, we need to let go of clinging to anything. Now, the traditional list is things are impermanent, things are insubstantial, and we suffer because we cling to things. So we perceive things as permanent, so we grasp onto them. We perceive things as substantial, so we grasp onto them, and therefore we suffer. So that's a traditional way of seeing it. I've been reflecting recently another way of talking about it, and I think that we cling. Another way of talking about it is we cling within space and we cling within time. So there are two other ways of thinking about it. We cling within space and we cling within time. So within space, we cling to things around us. We cling to things that we perceive within space. So we cling to our body, we cling to our possessions, and we cling to other people. Yes, there's all sorts of things in our environment we cling to, and we cling to our own body. And we cling to anything that we've to some extent become identified with. Yes, I think we can all relate to this. It's kind of like when you identify things like, this is mine, and like at the moment this chair's mine. If someone came and pushed me off this chair, I'd be like, that's my chair. But as soon as I finish this class, it's not going to be my chair any more than anyone else's chair. But at the moment, I'm identified to it, yeah, to some extent. But then that goes much deeper with other things. Yeah, so in our body is the deepest of those things. The most deeply we're identified with our body, and we cling to our body. Now, an image for this, that I've been thinking about is, it's as if we've got loads of arms. Yeah, so you can just imagine we've got loads of arms, infinite arms really, and we have hands that are out grabbing onto things. Yeah, so we've got these kind of hands, they're kind of imaginal hands, but we've got these things that are grabbing onto anything that we feel like is ours, we grab onto. So we're within space and we're grabbing onto all of these things. But no matter how hard we try, we can't actually hold on to them. That's the reality of things, is we can't actually hold on to anything. But because we can't, we grasp harder. Yeah, so we're holding on to all these things that we can't actually hold on to, and we grasp harder. And because we're grasping harder and harder, we're basically getting really, really bad handache. Yeah, so we can imagine like we're gripping harder and harder, it's not working, so we're gripping more and more. And like right now I can feel my hands hurting. So imagine we're doing that all the time with loads of stuff in our experience, including kind of like the deepest part of our body to our possessions and people around us. Yeah, so we grasp into all these things within space. But I think I like this as well, because you can imagine then, it feels so much nicer. It feels so much nicer when I've stopped doing that. So we're grasping onto it, but we let go. If we let go, we'll be free of that suffering. We're free of that discomfort. So that's an image for grasping within space, or clinging within space. But we also cling within time. So time is constantly flowing. There's nothing we can do about time. Time is constantly flowing. Things are constantly changing. And these things are constantly flowing. But what we do is we try and manipulate it. With some part of our mind believes that if we try hard enough, we can manipulate the flow of time. We try and resist things changing. If we like things, we try and resist it changing. And if we don't want them, we try and kind of speed things up. I remember this really, I was doing a PGCE when I was training to become a teacher, and I was finding it really, really horrible. And I just remember this sense of just really wanting time to go quicker. There was just some part of my mind just trying to be like, which obviously you can't do. But time's just constantly running through at the pace that it does, and there's nothing we can do about that. And the image that I've come up with this is that it's like there's a length of rope that's just running through our hands constantly. There's a rope just running through our hands constantly. And because we try and manipulate time, because we try and control the flow of things, we then grasp onto this rope. But no matter what we do, it keeps on flowing. But the harder we grasp, basically, the more rope burn we get. Yeah, so we're grasping on, but it keeps going through, and the harder we cling, the more rope burn we get, and the more it hurts, the more painful it is, the more suffering it is. And again, this image, you can imagine if we could just let go of the rope, then our hands would stop hurting. But the problem is we're always grasping on, and we don't even realise we're doing this. We're doing this on such a deep level, in so many ways, that we don't realise that we're clinging within space. We don't realise we're clinging within time. This is just how we function. This is how we're kind of instinctually function in the world. And the good news is there is something we can do about it. By practicing the Buddha's teachings, we can learn to let go of the things around us. We can learn to let go of the rope that's running through our hands. But we just need to be aware that to the extent that we do that is to the extent we suffer. It's kind of that tendency to grasp onto things is the root of all of our suffering. And yeah, so to continue on the root of clinging. So another way of looking at clinging is that consciousness clings to our bodily form. Yeah, so there's a thing called consciousness. It's very mysterious. We don't really know what it is, but in some way it's attached to this bodily form. So for as long as this body is living, consciousness is attached to it. But it's as if consciousness has the potential to be completely free and open from that. So consciousness has the potential to be clinging to a body, clinging to a form, or it has the potential to be completely free and completely open. But being attached to the body keeps consciousness limited, and it keeps it cramped. Yeah, so even if we don't realise it, the unenlightened state is extremely limited and cramped in comparison to what an enlightened mind would feel like. Yeah, so an enlightened mind would feel completely free, completely liberated, and in comparison to that, we feel limited and cramped. Now, when Naropa pours out the bag of gold, it's as if he's saying to Marpa, your consciousness is incredibly valuable. Yeah, like the gold is incredibly valuable, your consciousness is incredibly valuable, but it's trapped. It's trapped in your body, in the way that the gold is trapped in the bag. Yeah, so our consciousness is trapped by the fact that it's clinging to the body, in the same way that the gold is trapped in the bag. But when Marpa sees this, when Marpa sees the bag being turned inside out, he realizes that the true nature of his mind has no boundaries. Yeah, it has no boundaries, it's limitless, it has no thing to keep it cramped and limited. It's completely boundless, it's completely limitless. And it's said at the end of the story, they both stand there covered and surrounded in gold. So they're stood there together, they've emptied this bag, they're stood there, they're covered in gold, there's gold in the air, and they're just laughing together. Yeah, so Marpa has seen through his clinging, he's seen through the things that are keeping him limited, he's experienced this boundless consciousness, and they just laugh together as two beings who have seen through their attachments, they've seen through their self-clinging, and their consciousness is as free as the gold dust that's floating in the air and spreading around. Yeah, so I'm going to leave that there. Yeah, so really nice to be here with you tonight, and yeah, hopefully see you all again. See you next week.
Brilliant, thank you. Thank you.